Hi, this is Women's Poker Association, and this is Donna Blevins. And I am thrilled, absolutely thrilled to be here tonight. It's just, we're going to have such a great time. And you'll know me as the big girl of poker. And we're having a big girl poker chat tonight. And one of the reasons they call me the big girl is that I'm 6 feet 5 inches tall. And if you want to find out what I have to talk about, you can go over to biggirlpoker.com and see some of the things I've done. I've got a podcast over there too, Big Girl Poker Chat. But tonight I am excited because I'm going to be chatting with Duncan Palamourdas. And he's someone they look up to at UCLA in mathematics. He's written articles on all kinds of poker-related math. And he did some article series on things you can do in the final stages of a tournament, the math behind it. I am so excited. And when I was looking for some really neat comments about him, I love this. He has a gift of turning incredibly complex mathematical concepts into simple and easy to understand ideas and to convey them with humor to engage the class. And I want to let you know that when we met for a tech check a couple of days ago, we had a blast. He is hilarious. And another thing, this is his philosophy, and I love it. There is no such thing as a perfect truth when it comes to science. And that is incredibly important to remember. If anything, science has taught us humility, as does poker. And I want to share with you, this is Duncan's poker face. I mean, can you imagine staring across the table, shaking in the boots? I look forward to being heads up with you soon. And come on and tell us. Look, he's laughing. I'm so glad to see you're laughing. Go ahead, talk to us, Duncan.
That was the best introduction ever. I love it. I'm so glad to be here, by the way. This is amazing. I'm really glad to talk to you, Donna. This is amazing.
Super. Tell us how you got into poker at the university, UCLA. I mean, how did that happen? And what's your background in poker? And I just want to ask a lot of stuff, but let's just focus on that to begin with.
The actual interesting part is that they both happen at the same time. So when I was a graduate student at UCLA at the time, some friends of mine and myself, we got together, and I happened to be a little bit competitive in spirit, and I like games a lot. So we started playing a little bit of poker. We were playing for dimes, so nothing too serious, not too high stakes or anything like that. So I thought to myself, okay, how can I beat my friends? Fun fact, I was always under the impression that poker was mostly a psychology game rather than a math game, or better yet, a game that combines both elements together. And I thought to myself that, somebody needed psychic abilities to be able to win at poker, to put it simply. So I did a little bit of research, and I was actually at the time flabbergasted by the amount of math involved in the game. And I started doing a lot of studying because I'm incredibly interested in games in general. I was playing chess as a kid, backgammon. I actually got my nickname because I was playing backgammon. That's a completely different story. But I really loved games, so I started studying it. And one thing led to another. And before I knew it, I found an opportunity to introduce it to the academic world. That would be the short version. So while I was teaching at UCLA, I presented that idea of potentially teaching a class which is math related, the mathematics of poker, and everything that has to do with the game. And to my surprise, at first, after a little bit of what, are you crazy? Eventually, to my surprise, that class was accepted with an open mind, which was great. And then the classes picked up from there. So I'm really happy about that.
Did you know that President Nixon paid for college with poker?
I did not know that.
Yeah.
That is fascinating.
Isn't it fascinating? And actually, my husband, way before we knew each other, he actually put himself through school teaching people how to play rummy and gin rummy, and they'd say, well, teach me how to play, and he'd say, well, okay, I'll teach you some, but then let's play. And he was into poker so much before I was ever introduced to it in my late 40s. So I'm kind of a newbie to the game, I guess. Well, no, not really. Late 40s, and I just turned 70. So what do you know? So what I'm going to do is, since I saw that you like use slides too. I mean, I am visual, and I think a lot of people learning are visual as well. And we've got 8 really, really good questions that were submitted by members of the World Women's Poker Association. So I've actually put them on slides, and I'm going to show the slide again. And I'm going to read the question, and then my assistant Daniel is brilliant, and he gave a synopsis of what the question was. So the second part of the slide will be that. So I'll share that, and then we will read through it, and then I'll let you have the chair. Number 1, my biggest fear is that I see so many people blow massive chip leads going into final table being too aggressive. They go from first to getting out in 6th or 7th. And by the way, my husband came by and he was looking at the slide and he said, I do that. I said, yes, I know you did that. I said, you want to come and kind of, listen in? He said, no, I'll listen to the replay. He said, but I'm so looking forward to that. So I continue to play my conservative, tight, aggressive manner at final tables and usually get 2nd or 3rd. Is there any way possible to avoid variance heads up? And here's the synopsis. What is the best way to avoid variance at the final table, particularly heads up? So,
yeah, that's a great.
You're on.
Well, this is how we're diving into the deep questions. Yeah, this is actually a very popular question and a very difficult one to address. Let me first of all take a step back and let's start with a simple idea, which I believe it can be misinterpreted a lot at the poker table. Cheap or non-volatile is not always that cheap. In other words, things that seem cheap can actually be expensive in the long run. Right? The metaphor that I usually use is junk food. Junk food could be cheap in price, but then there's other side effects which can be way more expensive for health and other impacts that they have, negative effects that they have on our lives. Something similar happens to poker when it comes to aggression. Actually, I would say that aggression is, funny enough, the way to reduce variance, like being properly aggressive without necessarily being overly aggressive. So of course the question becomes how somebody finds a fine line between being aggressive enough so that they get the competition out, they thin the field out enough so that they can actually be able to cruise through the tournament, if that is even a term, but not too aggressive so that they end up shooting themselves in the foot, basically. And this is actually very complicated to answer, and it is what actually makes good players good. It's the fact that they're able to calibrate their game between not being passive and not being too aggressive. So that would be the first element, that being conservative is not necessarily as an antidote to variance as people may think. Being conservative can actually let other people getting cheap cards, free cards that could potentially lead to actually higher variance because we allow them opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't have if we properly address them out of the pot. So that's the first step. The second thing is that, and I think this is probably the most important, at least to me, that there is certain element of variance and luck that we cannot kick out of the game. And this is the part where if we cannot control it, we should better embrace it. So I don't know if you're familiar with with some of these graphs where people, and I wish I would have brought them with me because they're very, very telling, beautiful graphs. People with the same win rates, but because of the variance, some people who have, even though they have the same win rate, some of them are going to be great winners, whereas other people are going to be lower winners or even losers over time because of variance. So this is a very long way of saying there's a certain element of variance that we can never control. There is absolutely nothing we can do to get it out of the game. But the part that we do control probably assumes that we use aggression for it. And as a third segment to that question, I know it's a very deep question, so I'm trying to cover all the possible angles as much as I can in a short period of time. The third thing that I would say, especially heads up, because it happens that I play a lot of heads up, mostly cash games, not tournaments, but especially heads up, I would say one of the most important elements in heads up is aggressive play on the button, like min raising almost every button, even though that might seem too crazy for some people, especially the tighter players who are used to play like a strategy which is anywhere between, raising 20 to 30% of the hands pre-flop or even less at the earlier stages of the tournament. So aggressive raising on the button and finding opportunities to do what we call being sticky. Don't give up on that flop that easily. So that, like, finding opportunities to either aggress the opponent or ways to let them be aggressive when you have a good hand.
Doesn't it have something to do with a balance between aggression and the strength of one card in your cards, since sometimes your aggression will be called? And isn't the real term for variance luck?
Yeah, actually, it's actually interesting. Yeah, there is, I like nicknames. So I would love to call variance luck. Yes, that's a very good nickname, I would say. Yes. Basically, like mathematicians like to use fancy words like volatility or the average deviation from the mean and fancy words like that. But I like luck. Yes, like the chance, the luck factor. It's basically those things that we do not control. Like we throw, let's say, a ball, play baseball, we throw a ball, and just because the wind would go east versus west, we're going to have deviations. That's exactly what variance does. It's the things that we don't control. So we place a bet, and because our opponent is maybe on a bad day, they make a call or a fold that they wouldn't otherwise have. And so if they were on a different day, they would have played differently. That could change our results, even though our strategy is exactly the same. That's what variance is, like luck factors that we basically cannot control. I like that nickname.
So when people say they were unlucky, what they're really saying was that they had an unfavorable probability occur.
Yeah, well, that's yes. Well, I mean, I've actually written. This is a topic that I'm very interested in. Where people, they say they're unlucky. Well, they mean a lot of things. Like, for instance, somebody may lose with aces against kings, which is the classic, cooler pre-flop, right? Somebody has the aces and somebody else has the kings, and then the person with the aces loses to kings, and they say to themselves, "Well, I got unlucky." Well, yes and no is my answer to something like this, because the interesting thing is that a person with aces technically does not deserve 100% of the pot, right? And yet that's what they expect to get. They expect to get 100% of the pot, even though technically they deserve only 80% of it against kings. So in actuality, somebody will get lucky when we have aces against kings. So if the aces win, they're going to win 100% instead of 80, so they're 20% lucky. And if the kings win, they're going to win 100% instead of 20, so they're going to be 80% lucky. So whoever wins technically gets lucky, even though in the long run it evens out. So we like to sometimes, we like, because chances involved, we like to give blame to luck when we lose and then give credit to our skill when we win. So there is a certain factor that we absolutely do not control, and this is technically not being lucky, not being unlucky. This is what basically poker is. It's what we call, it's what it is.
Yeah, and I Let's go to the second question. Let's see. I probably put the hardest question first. Maybe not. Do you see this number 2 now? Do you see
I love it. Yeah.
How do you combat the pro who's raising 2.5 times under the gun when you're the button? Lost my button or hijack every single time. Happened to me last week, and I finally had ace queen and 3-bet him. He shoved, I called, and of course he had ace that time. So how can you best prevent pros or aggressive players from essentially stealing your button by aggressively raising out of position?
Excellent. So let me try to answer this question honestly, right? The best way to play against pros, I'm going to be very, very honest. The best way to play against pros is to change tables. I think that legitimate. I think like we, as you know, as a group, we tend to underestimate the power of game selection. So I would say that, and I actually was surprised when I was first started playing poker. I was surprised how much ego there is at a poker table, right? I mean, everybody was trying to play with the best players in the world and beat them. Whereas in actuality, even if you happen to be the best player at your table, would you rather play against 9 other amazing players, or would you rather play against players which are not so amazing? Now, but I don't want to cap out. I don't want to avoid that question. So, but I would legitimately think that the best answer to that question is avoid the pros or anybody who would give credit for being good at the poker table. That would be my honest answer. Now, I want to try to go to levels, and each level is going to be more specific. Now, the second level that I would address that question would be, just because we decided to play a hand against somebody who is aggressive, it doesn't mean we need to go all the way through. In particular, what I saw in this hand, we have an under the gun raise to 2.5x. The sizing is not that relevant at this point, but we have a generally very strong range raising. And then we decide, I'm not going to judge that re-raise, but for whatever reason, we decide to re-raise with ace queen. And it doesn't even matter what we have. Now, that player now decides to go all in. Under no circumstances we're obliged to call. We still can reevaluate the situation from there. So that would be my second point. And like, just because we decided to play back at somebody, it doesn't mean we have to go all the way through. Because, for instance, if that pro raises to 2.5x with a very wide range, but he only goes all in after that with aces, we can avoid losing to aces the moment they go all in, because they have that specific hand that we're losing to. So just because we started committing some chips, we don't have to go all the way through. That would be my second point for this question like that. Now, even more specifically, like, how do we play if we have playable hands like a hand like ace queen? Now, again, of course, everything is opponent dependent, but let's say that we're playing against a very competent, a very aggressive player who raises to 2.5x. Now, there's 2 important questions we need to ask ourselves. Are they fairly narrow in the ranges, or are they fairly wide? Because even competent players can deviate. There's some competent players who play a lot of hands under the gun, not very, very likely, but there are some competent players, most competent players, who play very few hands. So the fact that the pro raises 2.5x in a vacuum, if he is like most pros and he's raising a few hands, I would say most of our hands on the button should be folds. But let's say now whether we have a hand like ace queen, what do we do with a hand like that? Well, with a hand like ace queen, it's reasonable hand. I mean, it's ahead a lot of hands that he could have under the gun that he raises with, namely hands like ace jack. It's ahead of hands ace 10 suited. Maybe he's raising some of his suited aces if he's a little bit looser, like ace 5 suited comes to mind, ace 4 suited comes to mind. Those things that can also flop the wheel. So what do? Flatting there sounds like a decent strategy against most players, because they still have to play against us in position. No need to go crazy. We can make a call here, see what they do on the flop. We can either call them on the flop and see what they do on the turn. Again, remember, going back to point 2, we can always reevaluate. Just because we have a strong hand and we want to play against a player who takes advantage of us, it doesn't mean we have to get all the money in right then and there. Reevaluation here is very key. And just because he's a pro and just because they know what they're doing, it doesn't mean they can take away our position. So we can use that position to make the best decisions we can. So to summarize, change tables, that would be the number one. Number two, just because we got involved in a hand by putting some money doesn't mean we've made a commitment. And number three, against under the gun ranges, we can be very, very careful. Take it one step at a time. Calling is fine. See what people are doing and then reevaluate the situation.
You know what I'm going to do is I want to be sure that you have some extra time because we've got 8 questions total. And
okay.
What's your time frame in relationship to this? I don't want to drag it on. I mean, I really love these answers. Are you okay with time?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy. I want to give, because people took their time to ask their questions, I want to be thorough, but yes, absolutely.
I love this. I absolutely love this. And Daniel had said, this is absolutely fabulous. And he said, what you probably want to do is actually break it up into a couple of different videos. We're going to go ahead and do the whole thing, but I'm going to post it in separate videos so people can see them without having to do this whole thing. In relationship to play against pros, that was one thing that I learned immediately is if they're pros and it's a cash game, ask for a table change. Absolutely, 100% my criteria. I've been in the industry for 21 years and 22 years now, and that's still my preference. However, at a tournament, you don't have the option to do that. In relationship to playing back at someone, I think what people fail to understand is that the betting scenario is a conversation. And people need to have that conversation. Each hand is a conversation. And when people start thinking that way, I think they might be able to play differently, because when you change gears, and I think you need to shift your gears consistently based on the situation at hand. People sometimes think that they need to get into the aggressive mode and stay there, or they need to stay conservative. I think shifting back and forth based on what's happening is how we can get further, longer, and paid higher. When I had been off the felt for nearly 2 years, I thought, well, what am I going to do? I said, is it like riding bike? And this was after I had finished well in the World Series of Poker in 2007. I thought, well, and I was such an amateur in 2007, even though I finished in the top 4 women out of 6,400 players. But what I did was I said, I'm just going to go have some conversations. And out of 20 events that I played over a year, and that's not many because it was local and it had to do with family care, I cashed 4 out of 5 times. And that's a huge number. Is that a good math number?
I'd say so. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was because it was having a conversation. I was in the learning mode, and I think we have to get out of our comfort zone when we learn as well. Okay, let's go to the third and fourth question here. Let me show the screen again.
Absolutely.
Does this help?
While you're getting that question,
Yes.
So go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was about to say, I really love that metaphor, conversation versus a monologue, because sometimes like what happens in our head, we're like, okay, now I'm gonna, basically put all the money in against the guy. That would be the equivalent of a monologue instead of a conversation, right? Because the conversation can go back and forth. It's more fluid versus a monologue, which is, like one straight path, usually that leads to our demise. So I really love that metaphor, like conversation versus some sort of like parallel monologues.
But basically players are telling each other stories, and it's just that we need to determine whether their story is believable or not. And you have to go back. I think one of the reasons that Negreanu has been so right on, at least when he's on TV and he'll say, I think you've got, and that person had that, is because I think he goes back over and he keeps updating his profile. And I think updating profiles in your head about what this person is doing needs to be done continually. And I believe that's one of the things people fail to do, is that they have to continually update profile. People think, well, I'm not in the hand. Great, you're not in the hand. Do some work, because you need to absolutely get back to that.
Pay attention.
That's right.
Good.
Okay, the third and fourth question have to do with chopping at the table, at the final table. For deal making, under which conditions should you make a deal? And in daily tournaments, under which conditions would you be inclined to chop? And I am almost reluctant to bring in this part of the question to say, can you explain the three types of chop to our audience? The chip chop.
Yeah, no, I mean,
the ICM, the independent chip model. And by the way, I usually start out by saying my house rules is that we're not going to just talk in abbreviations. We have to say the words. And then 3, the even chop. So can you address that in, under 3 hours?
Sure. Absolutely. No, yeah. So again, when people are at the final stages of the tournament, they can decide to split the prize. And they can split the prize. I mean, the obvious way would be to split it evenly. It's not necessarily the fair way, but it's the obvious way. They take whatever the prize, for the sake of the argument, let's say the prize is, I don't know, like $1,000, and they split it 4 ways. So everybody gets $250. That'll be the fair way. Not really, but yeah. And the second way would be they can split the prize, the $1,000, proportional to how much chips they have. Like the person, for instance, who have half the chips, they will get half the prize. The person who has 1/10 of the chips will get 1/10 of the prize, and so on. And that's called the chip chop. And then there's a more elaborate method, which people call it the ICM, independent chip model, or let's call it the complicated method. So we have the complicated method. Basically, the complicated method accounts for all possibilities, all else being equal, meaning all skill being equal. What are the chances that each individual player would place in different positions? Like, given my stack size, what is the chance that I'm going to finish first? Given my stack size, what is the chance I'm going to finish second? And account for all of that. And then after we put all of that in a blender, we get the complicated number, which is called the ICM number. Luckily, calculators do that. So to sum up, complex method, the most fair of the methods, proportional method, also known as chip chop, and then the quote-unquote fair method, which is the even split.
Okay, so which one is best to do?
Okay, so I would say, without anything else, I would say probably anybody at the poker table, if they don't know anything else, they should probably push for the ICM, for the complex method, because that complex method takes into account all the possibilities. That would be the number one thing. Now, another thing, if we don't remember anything else, another thing is that the proportional method, also known as the chip chop method, the proportional method favors the big stacks, because effectively what the proportional method does, it assumes that the person who has 50% of the chips deserves 50% of the first prize and 50% of the second prize, which is obviously quite unfair, because, I mean, if they have so many chips, they should be more likely to go first rather than all the other positions. So they shouldn't get the biggest share of all the prizes. So if the listeners want to take something away, is that if they have a big stack, chip chop is favorable to them. And conversely, if they have a short stack, chip chop is unfavorable to them, meaning that the ICM is way better. But that's kind of like the quickest way of putting it. So ICM is probably the best, the complex method is the best.
Well, the only problem is that I understand math, but there is just no way I would understand how to even calculate the ICM, the independent chip model. I have to look at that, because when we first talked about it, I said, what is that? Intercontinental ballistic missile. So you love that. So, I don't understand it. I mean, I read your article about it, and mind you, I want to tell you what, I spent most of last Sunday, week ago Sunday, reading your articles, and only very, very few areas did I glaze over. When I let you know, you do such a great job, of explaining. But when it got to that, do the tournament directors do the ICM calculations? Do they do that?
Right. Luckily, yes, because these days with iPhones and everybody having access to technology, it's so much easier to so much easy to access the internet or their app on their phone. So these calculations, although very complex for humans, they're super trivial for computers. So literally, all you have to do is plug in the chips, the amount of prizes, and then you click enter and you get the answer. So, and people can cross-verify that on the different apps, and everybody's going to get the same answer because it's one method. It's calculated in a single way. What I tried to do on the article was try to explain that method to anybody who was curious of what goes in. But I think I made a disclaimer that people do not need to know what goes into these numbers. But yeah, it's just,
what app do you like for poker math?
I'll be perfectly honest with you. I have no idea. Usually, like when it comes to ICM, I just Google ICM, and whatever website happens to be number one in Google, that's what I use. I mean, it's so there's so many websites. I don't have any particular ones, so I just choose the first one.
Two words that my dear editor Daniel for my book MindShift on Demand told me that I use so much, I had to cut them out. And the two that I'm going to use right now are really? Seriously? I mean, it's just a case of Googling it and say here, okay. Okay, well, let's see if we can get into another one. Oh, I love this. I'm having a lot of fun. Are you having fun? Oh, and he said, literally was my third word. Actually, on one of the final rounds of editing of MindShift on Demand, he said we really have to talk about seriously. We really seriously do. And I said why? And he said because you have 354 times really is used in the book or something. And I said, seriously, it really is. Anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to the next one. Okay, number 5. At a final table, there are 2 players with 2 big blinds and 6 players with 15 to 25 big blinds each. How can you decline a chop, especially if everyone knows each other, i.e., for suggestions for declining chops, particularly among friends?
Okay, excellent. Yes, so I misread the question. Now I thought somebody was complaining. How can you decline chop? That's how I read it the first time. Like, how dare you decline chop? You're not supposed to. No, there are some people like that at the local casinos. Like, how dare you not take the chop? No, I understand the question now. Okay, this is a great question actually. Really, really great question. So. There are actually some really, really nice and polite ways. So I'm assuming the person who's asking that question, in their mind, they really do not want a chop. It's not that they're trying to get a great deal, correct? I mean, they really do not want a chop. Am I assuming correctly?
Yes, and okay. I tried to find my husband's hat, and he literally he and this was 10 years ago, he had this hat made, and it had the word chop, and it had one of those crosses put through it, round, like with no smoking sign, like that. And he wore it at the poker table, and I said, why do you believe that? And he said, because I need practice, heads up. I don't want to chop because I need to play down to the end of the tournament, and that's what I'm missing. So that's my feeling about not chopping. So go ahead.
Yeah, so my recommendation would be 2 things: honesty and politeness. I mean, just because we do not want what the rest of the group does, it doesn't mean we have to be hostile against them, right? And so very politely. So if we do not want to chop, there is a reason for that. Right? I mean, there's plenty of reasons. Some people would just want to gamble. Some people want to get first place. like the trophy. Some people want to get the practice. Like there's all sorts of different reasons. Some people think they're just better than everybody else. Now, if somebody wants to play, I would say just very politely say, I understand, I really do. If you don't mind, if that's okay with you, I'd like to play. I mean, I want to come to the tournament setting and have fun, or whatever the reason is. And I think that most people right away, they will appreciate that. I mean, there's nothing personal. I just want to play. And having interaction with people at the poker table, usually most people are very understanding when we're polite with them. So that would be the answer. Now, I want to make one specific comment. If the reason why we do not want to chop is the last one, namely because whoever is having that question, if let's say that Alice does not want to chop because Alice thinks that she's the best player at the table, my recommendation would be for Alice to still chop, but find a way to get some premium on top of what the basic deal method suggests. Because I do believe that in terms of profitability, like if we play for money, and if we don't just play for fun or like because for practice, or we don't play for the trophy, but if we play for money, I do believe that chopping is always the best way because it eliminates all the variance. So if the reason is not money related, if the reason is anything else, like, want to play for fun, want to have some practice, we want the trophy. If the reason is none of that, I would highly suggest to find a way to ask for a chop, but with a premium. So find a way to hint to everybody else, I want a chop, but I want a little bit more money than what the calculation suggests. Now, this is a little bit trickier, but if people really want to chop, there's always ways. Like, for instance, you can say, look, I don't generally chop, but if you guys want to chop, that's how much I want. I want X amount. If you can split that among you and you give me that amount, I'm happy. So that way nobody gets offended. I mean, you ask what you want, and if people are okay with it, they give it to you. If not, you continue playing. But that would be my recommendation, because a lot of winning players. Yeah, go ahead.
No. You're absolutely right. I mean, I had a few years ago during the World Series, I was over at the Orleans, I believe, in one of those tournaments that started 7 o'clock at night, and they're the ones that they're huge tournaments. Buy-ins $250, and there was like 450 people. Well, you start at 7 o'clock at night, you're not going to be finished until daylight. And when I got to the final table, I was chip leader, and I was feeling really strong, but I was tired. I was tired. And people are going, chop, let's chop. And I said, okay, fine. I'll take a little bit less than first, but I want to claim the title of first. And I said, so you guys can do whatever you want to with the money. And they said, great. And so they figured it out among themselves. I didn't get down to really negotiating and willing to negotiate until we got down to, I think, 5 players at the table. And it just seemed like it made more sense to wait a bit.
I love it. Yeah, that's a perfect example of very, very politely, very nicely, you give a clear picture of what you need. You're not offending anybody. If they're willing to give it to you, which they are, because also they're probably tired and you have the chip lead, that's perfect. If not, you can continue to play. I love it.
Well, it was a good night. I really I remember that tournament. It's always a good night when things when you actually took, had some bad luck along the way and got really low in chips, and then was able to do some mental shifting, some mental gear shifting, and just kind of settle down without getting reactive, and then being able to get back into the game. One of the things that I believe people should do is to find their authentic game, what their game is, rather than try to just mimic everybody else's game. And that when my best game is when I'm calm and in the now and just settled, kind of waiting. It's not like waiting for the perfect card to come. It's just waiting for situations, kind of like being a sniper, I guess.
I love it.